Hello. Thanks very much for coming. I'm Bill Saunders. This session is called What is to be Written, which is a partly serious and partly playful riff on Lenin, what is to be done. I'm now working to create the winter issue of Harvard Design Magazine, which is going to be called something like What is the Core of Architecture Now? It'll be an attempt to assess and also instigate some of the forces in the discipline of architectural practice and intellectual life. In part of that effort this evening, we'll be looking at the kind of architectural thinking that is best realized not in design, but in writing. Part of the related intention here is to pass the torch to new generations, or at least to get a small but telling sample of fresh kinds of intellectual work being undertaken. Starting in January, I will be retiring and moving to my own writing and consulting. My critical beast has been rattling its cage. When I began work in 1993 on this kind of thing, the writing in the discipline was largely produced as four kinds of things. Academic scholarship as a supposedly neutral uncovering and sharing of facts in journals like the JSAH and Journal of Architectural Education, the trade magazines, Record, Progressive Architecture, etc., devoted primarily to presenting new work, architectural criticism in the New York Times, Village Voice, Chicago Tribune, and of course many other places, and a fringe of theoretical speculation presented in publications like any, almost entirely Peter and Cynthia's world, so to speak. Almost 20 years later, writing in the discipline has greatly diversified, breaking out of such categorizations, in large part, of course, because of the colossal platform that the internet presents. Yet architectural books made in 2011 don't seem categorically different from books made in 1991. Timothy Hyde, Associate Professor of Architecture and recipient of the PhD from Harvard, thinks that this is partly an illusion, that the discipline of architectural history in particular has undergone changes that make our use of Lenin not totally ridiculous. This possibility is what we'll be exploring tonight. Timothy has been researching concepts of artifice in 20th century architectural and other theory. His forthcoming book is Constitutional Modernism, Architecture and Civil Society in the Cuban Revolution. He will be introducing our four exciting speakers, all of whom are making their lecturing debut at the GSD, and all of whom come from rather far-flung places. Please welcome Timothy Hyde and our special guests.
Thank you, and thank you, Bill, for organizing this or precipitating this particular event. I'm very pleased to introduce the four exciting scholars, in part, I think, because they're not familiar faces at the GSD, although it's certainly true that their recent writing and their recent editorial endeavors have had a very strong, a very apparent influence or impact upon the field more generally, directly upon the field, indirectly upon the field as well, but also because their work so clearly circulates already in the intellectual economy of the Graduate School of Design. It appears on course syllabi, I know. It also appears up on the desks in the trays. But because the four of them haven't spoken to you in person before and haven't engaged in conversation here before, it's really very exciting to have David Gissen, George Dodds, Meredith Tenhorn, Simon Sadler tonight for this particular conversation. The aim of the conversation, quite simply, is to solicit some speculation about the tendencies of architectural discourse, contemporary architectural discourse. More precisely, though, the aim is to debate not where this discourse is at present, but really where this discourse should be going. The intention in doing that is not to enforce some new sense or some categorical sense of the proper territory of architectural writing, or as what Bill said, what architectural writing should look like and in what forms it should appear. It's not to defend the boundaries of some notional disciplinary core to which architectural historians and architectural practitioners subscribe. To the contrary, the intention behind this conversation is actually to attempt to keep pace, and I do mean keep pace, with the displacements and the conversions and the shifts that necessarily characterize the production of knowledge in this field as in any other. As we prepare for the discussion, we began using the shorthand title that Bill mentioned, What is to be Written? And in speaking with the four participants, I've used that question or posed that question in a very literal sense, meaning what topics should architectural writing address? What should we write about? What disciplinary blind spots do we need to remedy? Do we need to address through our writing? It's also possible to understand this question as a means to consider whether there are topics that we, quite frankly, need to stop writing about and stop talking about in architectural history, and we might address that as well tonight. And more generally, of course, the question, what is to be written, asks for some reflection upon the production of historical and theoretical and critical knowledge in relationship to the practice of architecture and the pedagogy of architecture. Reflection on what is urgent, reflection on what is relevant, reflection on what is useful, reflection on what is possible in this continued evolution, as Bill alluded to, and the evolution between the relation of knowledge and profession. Each of the four speakers tonight is uniquely poised, I think, to take up this question, and I do expect that they'll offer very distinct interpretations of it. We'll begin by giving them the chance to make an opening statement of their choosing, and then we'll convene here for just an open-ended conversation about the topics that are raised. I'm going to give a brief introduction of each of the four speakers, and it is brief because all four of them have both voluminous bibliographies and a lengthy list of achievements, so I'm not going to cover those. Apologies in advance. But to give you some highlights, first, the first speaker will be George Dodds, who is the James R. Cox Professor at the University of Tennessee College of Architecture and Design. He's also a distinguished professor of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture. In addition to the books that he's edited on Building Desire, as well as the book Body and Building, George has served as the executive editor of the Journal of Architectural Education, the JAE, of the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture for the past several years. He's just stepping down from that position now. In his tenure there, he's shepherded through many significant changes to the journal, but in addition, he's also constructed several crucial theme issues, one on criticism, another on the year 1966, and another on the question of architectural design itself as a kind of research and inquiry. The second speaker is David Gissen, who is Associate Professor of Architecture and Visual Studies at the California College of the Arts. He is also the coordinator of the history theory curriculum there. David has published in several journals, including Grey Room. He's edited a recent issue of AD. Many of you, I think, will know his most recent book, which is Subnature, Architecture's Other Environment, which examines the sides or aspects of environment that are typically excluded from architectural discourse, things like mud, dust, debris, and so on. Third will be Simon Sadler, Professor of Architecture and Urban History at the University of California, Davis. Simon's work is also, I'm sure, familiar to many of you. He has really led recent scholarship on the countercultural moment in the United States and in Europe, both in journal articles, but also in his two extremely important books, The Situation as City and The History of Archigram, Architecture Without Architecture. And then the fourth speaker will be Meredith Ten-Hoor, Adjunct Assistant Professor at the School of Architecture at the Pratt Institute, and also a member of the Architectural History Collaborative Aggregate. Meredith has edited several books that deal with issues of the public economy, the political economy of architecture and its public appearances. Her research particularly focuses on political economies in modern architecture in their biopolitical dimensions, or in another shorthand, in the relationship between food and architecture. Among the books she's edited are Street Value, Shopping, Planning, and Politics at Fulton Mall, and she's also the author of the insightful essay, The Architect's Farm, in Above the Pavement, the Farm, which looks at the PS1 exhibition of the PF1 farm. Without further delay, then I'll ask George to come up and begin the provocations. George Dodds.
Thanks, Timothy. when I was invited to participate in this roundtable discussion, honestly, I had a hard time wrapping my head around the idea of what is to be written. It's a heady thought, particularly in a time when reading seems to be less and less prevalent, even though more and more books are being published, and I haven't quite figured out the relationship between the two. Architectural critics make arguments for what could have been. Architectural polemicists argue for what ought to be. The former comments on what is past, the latter propels a course toward what is yet to come. These two figures often overlap. Architectural history and theory have always been a response to the made, attempting to pose solutions to problems not readily addressed from within the strictures of practice. Whether focused on the past or the future, there is a present tense required of both critic and theorist, a grounding in the here and now, even if it's only to reject the present scope of architecture. Hermann Muthesius argued for the need to reinvent German architecture while remaking German culture, embracing mechanization but never losing sight of the primacy of dwelling and the coziness of home. Adolf Loos similarly focused on the sorry state of Viennese domestic interiors while rejecting foundational values of contemporary Austrian culture. Critic and polemicist alike write for his or her own time while envisioning another. This brings me to the heart of this brief talk, which begins, as many histories do, with a story and an apocryphal one at that. This one is of the students of Harvard's newly formed Graduate School of Design, ceremonially carrying the plaster casts of classical capitals and other historical figural fragments out of Harvard's Robinson Hall to be buried ostensibly in the courtyard facing the Fogg Museum. Anthony Olofsson discusses the well-documented denuding of the Hall of Casts in his book on bringing modernism to Harvard, absent this cleansing ritual, and its transformation, the hall's transformation, into something more aligned with, as he says, spare, monochromatic, planar architecture of European modernism, end quote. Appropriately, the newly whitewashed hall subsequently was known simply as the Great Space. And so a room, in quotation marks, through the agency of Dean Hudnut, in anticipation of Walter Gropius's arrival, enforcing Le Corbusier's law of Rippolin and Adolf Loos's critique of the misapplication of ornament, was transformed into a space, a term that became codified into architectural discourse with the publication of Siegfried Gideon's Space, Time, and Architecture, released in 1941. Not that Gideon is the first to privilege the idea of space in architectural discourse, following as he does the trajectory of Robert Wirker, Adolf Hildebrand, August Schmarzow, and Gideon's mentor, Heinrich Wölfflin. Unlike his predecessors, Gideon didn't limit himself to the classification and interpretation. He made space-making operational and a principle of canonically modern architectural production. Rarely mentioned in architectural discourse is Gideon's subtitle, The Growth of a New Tradition. For while Gideon was reconfiguring the first 3 decades of a wide range of modernist architectural practices, he carefully grounded architecture's present tense in a rich history that included Borromini and Brancusi, Percier, and Picasso. Timothy and Bill ask, what will be written? For the sake of our conversation this evening, reflecting on the potential of any single history to recalibrate the past in anticipation of future actions, this question prompts me to consider what will be rewritten, because that's often what we do as historians. Case in point, in many ways, we owe our present-day understanding of Le Corbusier less to the Swiss architect himself than to his Swiss reinventor, the historian Gideon, and his 3 ages of space. Before Space, Time, and Architecture, Le Corbusier was, very comfortable describing the new architecture towards which he was moving in terms of volumes. It's only after Gideon historicized and represented Le Corbusier to the architectural community in Space, Time, and Architecture that Le Corbusier invents his now famous L'Espace Indicible, an essay that became known to the English-speaking audience in Le Corbusier's The New World of Space, published here in Boston in 1948, to coincide with an exhibition of his paintings at the Institute of Contemporary Art. It was first published in a special issue of Architecture Aujourd'hui in 1946. Yet, in Modular 1 and 2, 1950 and 1955, in which he reprints the essay as a self-quotation, which is one of his favorite things, quoting himself. He cites as its source the year of its writing, not the year of its publication. Obsessed with historicizing and rehistoricizing his work, Le Corbusier annotates new editions of his more than 4 books with the original date not of their publication, but when he wrote the text, always pushing the origin story further back into an irretrievable past. Henry Russell Hitchcock, who published a snarky review of New World of Space, had his own book in 1948, Painting Toward Architecture. It is, in part, an extension of Alfred Barr's Cubism and Abstract Art, in which, of course, Barr codified synthetic and analytic cubism. A book that formed the foundation not only for Hitchcock's Painting Toward Architecture and Gideon's Space, Time, and Architecture, but also Rowan Tlutzky's seminal Transparency, Literal and Phenomenal, and countless other essays, projects, and buildings, my own work included. I've spent much time as a researcher, writer, critic, and teacher rewriting what was handed to me, always skeptical of the received view. This lapsed Catholic revisionism fueled my reinterpretation of Gabriel Graveckian's famous gardens for the 1920s in France. It's what propelled me into a 2-decade-long struggle with a discursive and photographic opacity surrounding one of modern architectural history's central icons, the Barcelona Pavilion. And it's what originally ignited the flame of my current work on the role of landscapes and gardens in the work of the 20th century Venetian designer Carlo Scarpa. Architectural critics make arguments for what could have been. Architectural polemicists argue for what ought to be. The former comments on what is past, the latter propels a course towards what is yet to come. Yet both depend on a literate public, a reading public. What is to be written? What's to be rewritten? A generation from now, we may be asking what is to be read and who will be reading. In what fertile soil will a new tradition grow? Also, in 1948, George Orwell, in his dystopic 1984, cautions, quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past. And yet, the past, though of its nature alterable, never had been altered. Whatever was true now was true from everlasting to everlasting. It was quite simple. All that was needed was an unending series of victories over your own memory." When we write, when we historicize, theorize, and polemicize, we enter into an anamnesis, a remaking through memory. But whose memories, and of what? In the case of Le Corbusier and Ineffable Space, we may well ask, what was he remaking? Whose memory did he dwell upon as he opened his eyes onto a new world of space? Was his relentless pursuit of his rehistoricized past an unending series of victories over his own memory? Thank you.
Thank you, George. David Gissen. Please help me welcome David Gissen.
Thanks. Thanks, Bill and Timothy, for having me. It's really great to be here, to have made the long trip with Simon. So I was thinking about talking about this book that I have in the works that's coming out in the not too near future. But instead, actually, I wanted to talk about some more marginalia that I work on, and hopefully wrap it into this theme that we have this evening. So I'm also going to commit the sin of reading because I have a little bit too much going on in my mind right now with work. So forgive me, but I've tried to write this in a conversational style. So how do I forward with the? Okay, I got it. Yeah, okay, all right, like that, or not? All right, this thing. Yeah. Okay. All right. Okay. We'll go back. All right. Okay. So for the past 10 years. I've produced and written about works that I often call experimental architectural history, or more recently, architectural historical practice. I've completed projects of my own during this time within this particular area, and I often write about the works of others, self-proclaimed experimental preservationists, urban counter-historians, the makers of architectural effective histories, or the producers of critical, conceptual, and curatorial practices. when Timothy and Bill asked me to simultaneously consider what I consider to be some of the most important topics that have not yet been written about, and to discuss some recent work of mine, I wanted to focus on this form of practice, or the idea of an alternative way of doing history embedded within these practices. I find the work liberating, sometimes frustrating, under-theorized, and very often difficult for people to take seriously. So architectural historical practices include some of the following types of work: reconstructions of lost buildings as a form of public agitation, fictitious architectural and urban histories, preservations and reconstructions of otherwise unreconstructible architectural historical forms and experiences, and the extension and making public of archival practices into unfamiliar spaces and landscapes. In the interest of time, let me provide you with one description of a very recent work of mine, a contribution to an exhibition titled Landscape Futures, Instruments, Devices, and Archives. It represents some aspects of the approach. This exhibition was curated by Jeff Mano, who's the writer, editor of the Building Blog, and it's on display at the Nevada Museum of Art in Reno until February 2012. I was the only historian and theorist invited to participate in this show. So my contribution, titled Museums of the City, investigated how that skein of stuff inside museums used to protect, maintain, and visualize historical objects might migrate out into the city at large. What we understand to constitute material history is very often the matter, art, objects, nature, that we carefully illuminate in a museum, prohibit people from touching in public space, place in controlled environments and archives, and conserve in often highly visible ways. Museums of the City examines the potential power embedded in an interior framework that makes matter into objects of history, and how this can be turned into a more public, monumental, and external form. Out in the city, we see these frameworks oriented towards a variety of important human-made and natural urban landscapes. Surrounding these sites, we see the type of environments that visualize and maintain important objects, protect them from people and time, and that situate them as opportunities for reflection. What matters as much as the sites focused on in the city in these images, urban rivers, highways, monuments, and verdure, is the apparatus that transforms urban stuff into objects of historical contemplation. So museums of the city, like other works of architectural historical practice, occupies a disciplinary space between more normative forms of work conducted by either a historian, scholar, or a designer. These types of projects engage with ideas about history. Many emerge from historical labor, but they're not textual historical investigations, obviously not, nor are they engaged with debates within architectural design. Many of these works project a form of seeing, objectifying, and reconstructing the world that often reigns within the space of the archive into typically non-archival spaces and things. The extension of a museum to the city, the preservation of a building's dirt and pollution, the reconstruction of a lost smell in an important building, the exhibition of archival acts. This is something that makes the work historical in mentality, but also often public too. Ultimately, these works make history their content, but a history without historicism. By that I mean that they elude and represent the concept of a past without representing that past as the experience of historical styles. I should probably speak for myself, but I'm convinced that this type of work emerges from two interrelated disciplinary phenomena that are very much related to things I imagine we'll be talking about today. Number one, the rise in the US of the architect/scholar, the architect with a PhD who is often confronted with juggling an architectural practice and historical writing. And number two, the appearance of architectural history as a form of vanguard and agitational contemporary practice. This has its roots in the anti-operative critiques of someone like Manfredo Tafuri. It reaches a type of intensity in the HT programs of places like this or MIT, and in contemporary journals like Grey Room. I think this work attempts to capture the agitational project of history, but operate outside the pendulum swing that leaves the architect PhD either caught between design practice and historical writing, or attempting to interrelate them in the manner of some very interesting projects, like maybe Reinhold Martin and Kadombari Baxi's practice comes to mind. So, when thinking about what is to be written, I'm interested in thinking about these types of practices, and I am interested in writing about them. But more bluntly, I'm interested in ways of being an architectural historian that are outside writing itself. So, thanks.
Thank you, David. And please welcome Simon Sadler.
What a privilege to be joining you for this panel. Thank you. A couple of weeks ago, I was mulling over Bill and Timothy's email asking me for a highly concrete and a highly brief taste of my current work when one of its subjects died. There we go. This is a familiar problem for scholars of late modern and contemporary topics. But the untimeliness of Steve Jobs' death focused an almost unprecedented popular attention on design. Sure, plenty of people complain that Jobs was a robber baron who, in pursuit of product perfection, allowed the introduction of carcinogens into his factories. To put that another way, Jobs' designs were more than computing devices. They served as touchstones for our nebulous matters of concern, to borrow Bruno Latour's endlessly useful phrase. At least I find it endlessly useful. In this case, our concern about relations of production that mostly pass unnoticed. And as you see here, Steve Jobs has built our expectations to expect more than a computer. I might then compare Apple to OMA, whose designs, I argued in a recent book chapter, are similarly offered up as touchstones for public concerns about technology, biopolitics, global power, and the like. Apple pursued an idealist beauty, OMA a beauty of terribility, providing us with contrasting images for the early 21st century. Jobs, inspired by Zen Buddhism and the Whole Earth Catalogue, was in some ways a quintessential representative of design in Northern California's Bay Area. For a project on Californian design that we're conducting at the University of California, I'm exploring a hypothesis at the moment, it's sort of tentative, that Bay Area design, from the verandas of the Bay Region style to the area's magisterial infrastructure, has been formed around what we could call a sort of culture of connection, a seemingly delirious holism fusing nature, communications, politics, and economy. Witness, for instance, the countercultural architecture that is so intimately tied to the Bay Area, the documentary sources for which I am also now compiling with my colleague Caroline Maniac for MIT Press, just down the road. Well, there you have a highly brief taste of my current work. I'm considering how design, there's actually a bit more, how design provides lapidary statements, sort of really sort of refined, sharp statements about general public concerns and reformist agendas. This despite, or perhaps because of, the inherent push-pull of different actors in the design process, which we all know about, but which as an historian I find really hard to handle. And because I see in design this search for bearings, I try to switch study between design's different modes and sites, weighing up the architectural canon, the OMAs, back to back with, say this, the nebulous Californian ideology. I'm concentrating for the moment on the understudied archives hailing from the counterculture and from my home state of California, because they're rich in the sorts of foolish venture captured in the observation once made by the situationists, that design, that sort of great art of reality, is a means of knowledge and a means of action. This phrase really resonates with me. It is architecture's combination of hermeneutics and reform, put more simply, its will to learn about the world by attempting to change it, that intrigues me as a scholar, and also as a teacher, and also as a political subject. This is a trajectory for history and criticism that I'm coming across in the work of colleagues too. Somebody just mentioned Reinhold. As though we are trying to understand the machinic qualities of design in a really uncertain world. But there is, of course, much work to be done in clarifying whether design is as a teleology, apparatus, and morality can operate now, and how it operated in the past. There is perhaps a certain obscenity in the belief that design and design scholarship can do anything about the world, given the scale of the problems the world wakes up to on a daily basis, from child abuse, my wife is training to be a social worker, to environmental toxicity. Yet there is also something profoundly reassuring about design's will to reform. As the designs of Western political states are dismantled, returning their societies to something essentially pre-New Deal or pre-welfare state, and in some ways pre-democratic, architectural design is revealed as a holdout of 19th century reform, at its heart still pursuing a liberal political hermeneutics, worrying about how to fix the public realm and discover common concerns, usually through unlikely alliances with capitalism itself, if needs be. Perhaps the discipline is really a salon. But even if that is the case, it's extremely significant for me that this splinter from the 19th century public sphere survives in the era of simplistic news cycles. And that this salon is so insistent that the world actually is complex, that the depiction of it as a tangle awaiting intervention is part of the discipline's iconography. A couple more tangles for you. There's not really time to read these captions, but you may well be familiar with these messes into which designers dive. So the critical study of the design of design itself as a salon, network, medium, maybe above all a university extension, might be one way in which to better understand architecture's historic and continuing role. I suppose I'm approaching that inquiry really from the outside in by studying the sort of para-architectures of counterculture and Silicon Valley, for example, and by promoting a sort of para-architectural history for the classroom. Now, I'll just explain what I mean by that. I've come to believe that architectural history is a wonderful pedagogy for general education. Now, I work at a land-grant university with no specialist architecture school. Yet general education students readily appreciate the core lesson of architecture, or one core lesson at least, and that is that in a seemingly formless world, form is found, and degrees of failure are inherent in the pursuit of reform. Consciously or not, architecture has been showing this tirelessly for a long time. I don't mean to be glib when I say that the satirical magazine The Onion captured something of that public wonder last week about design when it joked that Jobs will be remembered for the fact that he was able to sit down, think clearly, and execute his ideas. And there it was again in Bill and Timothy's email, asking me for something highly concrete and highly brief, which was in its kind way asking me for something properly designed. It is the concision and concreteness of design that I'm finding makes it an exemplary tool for research and pedagogy, the way that design somehow finds forms that in turn lend form back to our concerns. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Simon. And now the fourth speaker, Meredith Tendhor.
Thanks so much, Timothy and Bill, for inviting me to participate in this discussion. It's great to be in a group of people whose books I really admire as well. So it was really hard to deal with the question that Bill and Timothy asked, what's to be written, because I find that most things that are written with passion, energy, and desire to be pretty good reads. So I feel like my criteria might be less about topicality and more about a kind of attention that's paid to the topics of any given book that somebody finds important enough to write. Still, as Timothy mentioned, I find myself really attracted to the theme of political economy and architecture, and I find that I return to it over and over again. By political economy, I mean how architecture is produced, consumed, and distributed, and also how it's a medium for debate about what's public and what's private. I think architecture is one of the best media we have to wage these debates about what we want to share, how we want to occupy space, and how we want to subdivide it. Obviously, this is incredibly clear right now with the occupation of Zuccotti Park in downtown Manhattan as part of Occupy Wall Street happens, and all these debates are staged about who the space actually belongs to. There's a really long tradition within architectural history of writing about political economy. So this isn't a discourse that I think that we need to reinvent, but rather one that we need to reconfigure in light of new technologies and new means of distributing texts. I think we need more writing that deals with the changing conceptions of what's public, more truth-telling about how architecture is made and who it's made for. And at a time when we witness the disappearance of privacy, we need to figure out how we cope architecturally with that disappearance. Okay, so within this theme, there are three subtopics that I would love to see more writing about, and it's a little bit awkward, but I'm going to present my own writing in here as well, because obviously if I thought it was worth writing about, I think it's worth reading more about as well. I'm sorry for the narcissism of that. But one thing that's always really interested me is what Deleuze calls minor histories, and by that I mean small movements, small architectural projects, things that aren't already absorbed into the discourse of architectural history and theory. I think we've documented many of the major initiatives of the West in the 20th century, but I think that we need more writing about what happened when people came together and tried to create new forms of social space with architecture. I think that this work tends to be most interesting and compelling when it connects historical examples to really contemporary problems. So in my own work, as somebody who's interested in sustainable agriculture, somebody who likes to eat a lot, and somebody who's interested and have many students who are interested in figuring out how we can better design the food supply, I started looking at designs for farms, markets, and distribution systems that architects worked on from the 18th century to the present, and I published a very brief resume of this research in this book that Timothy mentioned, Above the Pavement, The Farm, which describes Dan Wood and Amal Andreas's really beautiful Public Farm 1 project at MoMA. In the essay I wrote in this book, I looked at a number of plans for farms and markets. This is Nicolas Camus de Mézier's A l'eau blé in the center of Paris, which was built to basically stop famine by improving the food supply. And Camus de Mézier's idea was really that architecture could solve the problem of distributing bread and grain to the entire country. Obviously, a kind of lofty aspiration for architecture, but one that was built and realized nonetheless. And I also looked at projects like this. This is Kisho Kurokawa's Agricultural City, an unbuilt project for MoMA, and strange designs that I unearthed in municipal archives from all over Europe for trying to improve food distribution systems. I was interested in these kinds of little attempts to improve the food supply because I think it's a means of collecting precedents, honoring past experiments, and being inspired by them, one that might be useful to us today. This is another one, a project for a portable fish farm, which would provide enough protein for a year from the 1970s. Obviously, when architecture students see these kinds of projects, today they're often surprised that they were realized so far in the past, because it seems like something that's absolutely necessary now. So I do think that one of our tasks as historians and writers is to collect and gather and make this material available so that we don't forget our architectural past. I'm next interested in infrastructure and its relationship to urban change. I think this follows on the remarks that Simon was just making, but in this era when it's considered to be mind-blowing when Elizabeth Warren reminds people that infrastructure makes corporate profit possible, we need to look at the design systems that actually help us to build our current economy. In some of my research, I've been looking at this giant market called Rungis, which is the world's biggest wholesale food market. Many of you know about Les Halles, the famous food market in the center of Paris, which was active from the 19th century onward. And people bemoan the fact that Les Halles was destroyed in the 1960s and replaced with a shopping mall and a transit center. If you are in France, this is one of the primary examples of postmodernism that we know of. But if we really want to understand what the postmodernism means and what the postmodern world is, I think we have to stop looking at the architecture of postmodernism and look a little bit at the infrastructure of postmodernism. We need to understand how places like Rungis actually materially reorganize space and make new forms of new economies and new forms of distribution possible. For instance, in the case of Rungis, these architects' designs for this highly efficient food market in the suburbs of Paris made it possible for farmers to consolidate their holdings and adopt industrial agricultural methods and actually sell industrially produced food at a large scale. So we wouldn't have the kind of food system that we're all very critical of today if it weren't for infrastructures like this designed by architects. Okay, the third topic that I think that we need to know more about, I'll get through that, is property and law and the relationship of how buildings get made through current regulatory structures and architectural production. And there's so much exciting work on this topic being done right now. I'm thinking of Sandy Zipp's Project Manhattan projects which outlines how urban renewal transformed Manhattan. Beryl Satter's book, Family Properties, which describes how speculation created housing ghettos in Chicago. Interborough Partners' work on open and closed cities and planning regulations that helped to make that possible, as well as the architectures that emerged from them. Danny Abramson's work on obsolescence, and how buildings that are planned for short lifespans rely on certain structures of finance and capital and determine in some ways the architecture that we see being built in a number of cities, as well as Catherine Ingraham's work on how architecture is a means of guaranteeing wealth. My own work on property and law is in this book, Street Value, that I co-wrote with Rostin Wu from the Center for Urban Pedagogy. And basically, we found that one of our favorite places in downtown Brooklyn, one of the most raucous, inventive urban spaces, a kind of center for hip-hop culture, was being rezoned by New York City in 2004. And as an attempt to rezone Fulton Mall, city planners wanted to replace the district's hip-hop culture with a kind of more sanitized Ann Taylor loft-like version of retail commerce. And when we started looking at this site and how regulation was going to transform not only what was built, but also who shopped in the space, we realized that there was a very long history of this happening on Fulton Mall, one that had stretched back to the 19th century. So our book was an attempt to document successive attempts to redevelop this district, as well as to understand why some of the claims that the city was making, which seemed to have nothing to do with race and class, actually had everything to do with it, and that had gone back to the 19th century. So I think it's really important to try to figure out how architecture serves as an excuse to change who uses cities and to contribute to a better understanding of the political economy of architecture within that context as well. And I guess it's good that I'm going last, but I also feel like I have to say that it's really difficult to think about what is to be written because all of the projects that I've shown actually come out of either activism that I've done or hunger or talking to local grocers or speaking with my students, and they all come out of urban engagement and discussions. So what's actually written is only a very small portion of what my work as an architect is, and I think that's definitely in line with what you were talking about, David. So given that most of us, what we publish is just a small portion of what we lecture on, provoke students with, whisper to colleagues, and rant about online, and given that so much of this is now transcribed, like this lecture, distributed in public, I think we have to think about why we write what we write and how writing is different than other whispered forms of conversation and lectures given in public places. Thanks.
Find a chair. Well, Meredith, you apologized for the narcissism, but I'll start by complimenting all four of you on the lack of humility in the four presentations. I think there's a certain kind of healthy presumptuousness in the way that you presented the work that was unapologetic and sort of unqualified in the claims. And I actually want to pursue a bit what I think the presumptuous aspects are as a way of opening the conversation. What I mean by that is that there's a kind of frankness, I think, to the declaration that we're all beginning with a rewriting, frankly, with a kind of what I mean by the presumptuous, I think, to begin with, in the first presentation, in your presentation, George, the frankness of the declaration that this is all a rewriting, that the commencement of this process is a kind of erasure, and that we need to be deliberate about that erasure. And I think that the subsequent presentations all at least were opening up the question of how it is that you replace one understanding with another, or what the motive is for such a violent act, and for what is very apparently a violent act. So as an opening, I'd like to ask really how far you're willing to go in this process. And I can start with you, David, since you're really raising this. How far, and you as well, George, how far are you willing to go in that act of erasure? And what I mean is, in the sense, what kind of level of say, invention, level of reinscription, and self-legitimation can we tolerate in the rewriting process that takes place in architecture? So if we go into the archive and discover the new explanation, the smoking letter that says it was not about A, it was about B, we're on fairly firm ground, we think, as scholars, in this rewriting process. But as we draw the archive out into more and more mediated form, as you filter it through different kinds of experimental practices, or as it already seems predisposed towards some urgent end, some desire to prove the validity of something in the present, how far are you willing to allow for a kind of distortion, what we would hypothetically call a distortion of this original archival fact? I'm using, I think, very conventional terms of the kind of the validity, inherent validity of the archive, the need to reproduce it faithfully or authentically, and I'm proposing those simply polemically, not necessarily as an endorsement of that kind of historical practice. But I'd like to begin anyway by talking about at what level are you, maybe this is a much more simple way of putting it, at what points have you found yourself uncomfortable with your own work?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay, well, first of all, I totally agree with what Meredith was saying, and I think that was something that I was trying to get to, in the sense that history and theory entail many different kinds of labor, right? And that generally we only have so many, we have a limited means, limited forms in which that labor appears. So generally speaking, our labor appears as formal essays or public presentations, lectures, and maybe a few other variations on that. So the work that I was speaking about interests me because I think it speaks to some truth about the labors that happen in history and all kinds of manner of historical work and how those might appear in new ways. Does the work make me nervous? Absolutely. Do I think that, I mean, I can speak for myself, continuing the narcissism that we've been discussing. Do I think that, personally, do I think that this could be the only form of practice for myself? Absolutely not. I mean, it's very important for me to make my work appear in more traditional formats as well. But this work interests me because I think, again, speaking of labor and investment, we have an issue right now in architecture in which we have this architect PhD phenomena, right? And we also have this idea also that architectural historians practice architecture. That's a great addition, but I think it's a relatively new addition. So I think when you consider that novelty and the novelty of the types of people that we're training, there's opportunity for more novelty. So, that this work is simply another expression of the way history appears and its labors to us as architects in academia and outside. Right? Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you please jump in. It's not going to be question and answer. You can talk to each other directly.
Okay. I will. I'll do anything, and it's not like this is unprecedented. So actually, as we're talking, I'm thinking about. I'll be honest. One of my heroes, Rayner Banham, and he was willing to ham it up and be a clown. I heard a story once how he arrived for a class. A formal lecture at the Courtauld Institute on a molten bicycle and cycled down the aisle, and then, but that's kind of like it's a type of provocation. But nobody, people would accept surely that his scholarship was absolutely sound. So in other words, he's thinking about architectural scholarship in a really robust and rounded way, and there are moments when the demand for that is public discourse, and there are moments when it's a demand of the classroom, and I'm sure many of us who've taught have sort of said things in class and then asked students not to repeat it because it's just something I just came out with, but do you get the idea? And then there are moments where, to some extent, tonight I kind of found myself sweating over every word on the plane, and then there are moments when I put in the footnotes. So I'm just sort of, I suppose what I'm getting at is I'm not at all concerned with the idea that that architectural scholarship is an either-or proposition. I think it's a really, really robust tool, and there are all sorts of things we can be doing with it. There are moments when we're talking to each other within the archive, and there are moments when we're trying to draw in new publics. And I'll just actually add as well that there is a new public just sitting out there. There was a time, until very recently, that an archive was something that was sort of off limits, and you had to have a letter of recommendation to go and look at it, and you'd put white gloves on, and there might be, you always hoped, the letter, the smoking gun, saying the way things really were. And a sobering thing that happened, and that was actually how it was for me when I was trying to research Archigram. I couldn't actually find the archive in large part. It was a secret where it was. Now it's all online. And there is something astonishing about that. And I'm sure there are still things missing, but it does mean now that it's in the public realm. Who needs me? And hopefully somebody does. I mean, there's still an answer to that, and it then might be that my scholarship isn't primarily of hoping to find that letter, but of saying why that letter really matters, or trying to cultivate interest around that letter. And that still, I think, comes from a protracted engagement with the material over a long period of time.
But isn't there still then a concern that even if the issue is not whether or not the work will be taken seriously, right, by say a scholar or by whatever audience you're caring to address, if that's not the moment of sort of self-consciousness, is there still a concern though for the outcome of the work, that what will happen as you unleash these different kinds of processes, these different work? It seems to me that that in the talks there are several moments where you're arguing for a kind of activism, and you named it frankly, Meredith, that there is activism here, and that implies to me that you desire a certain outcome. And so it's not a question of whether you're taken seriously as a scholar, but the fact that this work might not do what you want it to do. So as things are unleashed into this kind of free realm, I would suggest that it's still not a question of anything is fine. I mean, that's not the argument that you all are posing, because you still want very particular ends out of this. And I'm curious to what the difference is when the end is not your own, say, legitimate authority as a scholar, but the end is a desired active outcome. Does that introduce, not again a distorting effect, but does that introduce a different kind of concern or anxiety into the work and how you do it? You seem to be searching for methods that will allow a certain outcome to be, if not guaranteed, at least highly likely. And is that reoriented the work?
Yeah, I think the answer to that question has a lot to do with distribution, too. So, like, how do we actually write this thing with all of this newly available material, or like in the Fulton Mall book, we ended up talking to some planners who had designed Fulton Mall in the 1960s, and they basically came out and told us that they were told by department store executives to get more white middle-class people on the mall. I mean, there was the smoking gun that we were looking for to kind of indict these past people, but trying to figure out how to then make those insights available to decision makers who are going to change things, and also make it available to people who care about architecture and care about urban space is really tricky. Like, so you have to figure out whether there might be different homes for different aspects of your project. Like, for instance, with that book, we found out that the agency that's responsible for redeveloping the mall had actually bought 30 copies of our book. So we thought, great, we really wrote it for architectural historians and city buffs and people who cared about gentrification in Brooklyn, and actually it ended up not reaching its target audience through their agitation, but directly. So I think that you have to make room for those kinds of strange outcomes in your work, but I'm not really sure that I know how to plan for them as a writer. But I think that we do need the help of teams of publicists, bloggers, decision makers, curators, a very different kind of public than we needed in the past in order to get our work read and discussed and making impacts. And that's something that is challenging to learn as somebody who's trained as an architectural historian.
Yeah, I think when I hear your question, I think of this practice. I don't even know if people are discussing this so much anymore, but the idea of research architecture, which I recall as recently as 5 years ago, was very much discussed through programs like Goldsmith's as an alternative to history theory and criticism, that we invite students in with very powerful and predetermined political programs that then do research that supported their political agenda. And speaking bluntly, I find that particular type of practice that's so oriented towards the student's political viewpoint, and then the research and the archival work supports that, I find that to be a failure. And just because it's so predetermined. So the way you're talking about something that emerges from a historical framework, and then you build this consensus around some idea that presumably comes after the historical research, and then determines whatever your political agenda might be, seems much more to have much more potential. Right? Then you're familiar with this research architecture method. Yeah. I find that program very disturbing to me. I don't know why. It's it's strange to me. Yeah, as a model of archival research. Yeah.
Yeah, I think we were talking a little bit before about the need to make room for surprises in your research. Like, I mean, all of us, I'm sure, have encountered the phenomena of thinking that we're writing about one thing and realizing that we're writing about something completely different, or that, the people that we thought were really important actually did nothing. We have to toss them out and come up with an entirely new thesis. Like, there does need to be room for that in the act of writing.
But it seems it is a fine line what you're describing, the kind of indictment of a research architecture as towards a predetermined outcome versus a kind of oriented historical practice. I mean, it seems like a very fine distinction, and I wonder, is the distinction there that the research architecture is propositional, that it's actually proposing the concrete, this is what will then be done, as opposed to the sort of historical contextualization being, I will show you how it is, what the present is, as opposed to what the future should be. I mean, is that where the limit is? I think that I'd want to press you on the kind of almost the ease with which we're able to assume a very curatorial role as historians, and then kind of slip out of that into something where we hide behind. I'll stay with that. Hide behind the lack of proposition in our work. That there's no conclusive claim solution being set forward, and therefore it holds back. And I'd like to actually ask. I don't know if this was part of it, but I'd like to ask you, George, about this a different kind of curatorial role, since you had, whether it was enviable or unenviable, I don't know, the task of actually making decisions about, say, the propriety of a certain kind of work or another, and also categorizing certain kind of work as research, as design research, and so on. In your role as an executive editor, how did that happen, and what kinds of distortions does that introduce into a process, the sort of framing of this work by a particular kind of designation as research, as scholarship, or as design, such that you can distinguish between the kind of propositional dimension of a research architecture and the, say, contextual attitude of a activist scholarship, if I can invent that category for architects.
Right. Yeah, I was the editor for the Journal of Architectural Education for 5 years, and during that time, one of the first things that I did as the executive editor was establish two kinds of trajectories for the kinds of articles that we'd publish: scholarship of design and design as scholarship. And I have to say that the seemed like a good idea at the time. When you get beyond places like the GSD and you're at other kinds of places such as land-grant universities or even not, you find that there's in architectural education, there's a reticence to assign the term scholarship to what architects do, and there is a big distinction also between research and scholarship. These are connected, but distinct, which is one of the reasons why we have two different words for them. When you ask people to think about design practice as a kind of form of scholarship, that's even more problematic. It's curious that in my tenure as the editor, one of my primary goals was to profoundly increase the amount of architectural production that we published in the journal. We wanted to publish more design, to put it simply, because the bottom line is that most schools of architecture are populated by people with Masters of Architecture degrees who teach studio and something else. That's pretty much what the rank and file is out there. And so this was a way of ostensibly engaging them more fully. And it had exactly the opposite result. We found that people were more reticent to submit their work because they found it difficult to think about it in a scholarly way. And yet we all operate in something called a university. And we're professors who ostensibly profess something. And yet there's a reticence to think about what we do as sort of proper scholarship. It's all bound up in a long trajectory of especially in the United States, of anti-intellectualism, which has a long and jaded history in this country, and certainly finds its way into architectural education. So I found myself in kind of a rear guard position, curiously, in that operation, trying to bring scholarship to the fore in a journal that's supposed to be about architectural scholarship.
Mm-hmm. So there's a presumption then, maybe as well, that the activists, the scholarship, say, that you're proposing, Meredith, or the kind of bringing the archive out that I think that both David and Simon, you're talking about, there's a sort of presumption there that that there's a less than willing recipient to that, or no, that you found that the work is readily received by your students, but your students as representatives of the general public, or the general public in your case? I mean, if scholarship is something that seems to be a kind of something that pushes away design in the context of the journal, is scholarship something you have to mitigate in order to popularize your work?
I hope not. That would be really depressing. Yeah, I mean, I think we have to figure out maybe how we use scholarship tactically and strategically, like where we really think it's going to do the most good. And I think that does come from answering questions that come up for students, and questions that seem to be really current, because we often find that there are incredible architectural precedents for them, and architectural histories that we can retell because of the desires of the present. And that sounds very much like instrumentalized scholarship, but I'm not sure that that's something that's always a bad thing. I think we also need to be able to talk about how we produce our work, and like how it's funded, and and the fact that because so many things are online, we don't have to travel to far-flung places. It's not impossible now to write really good histories rather quickly in some cases, or at least to collect and gather material and make it available to other people rather quickly. So because it's possible to produce scholarship more quickly and assemble material at a different rate, we can think about how we deploy that work a little bit differently. We can deploy it sometimes really quickly. We can deploy it over time. I think that changes the tenor of what we're doing.
Maybe as a way of sort of clarifying what I'm saying, what I appreciate in your question, Timothy, is that in a way what we're asking again is whether history, it's that old question about being operative.
Yep.
And I suppose what I am trying to make a pitch for with architectural history, at least the way that I am trying to think about it, isn't that I have some sort of agenda that I can imagine in the future, that I can start now by constructing a history that points towards it. It's in a way a sort of more romantic ideal of the bourgeois public sphere. What I'm trying to tell my student, I mean, the morale in California is so low. And,
We're not interested in history.
Sorry?
There's no interest in history in California.
Just this sense that, you know, the Californian dream is over, and the university is going to get contracted. And so I suppose what I'm trying to... So my romantic view of history is to say, well, you know, look, kids, you know, actually things do happen. Agency does happen. We actually don't know the outcome of history. I suppose that's my point. Yeah. Look, I'm going to show you all of this crazy stuff that you would never have believed how it turned out. And by doing that, I'm trying to keep the pool stirred. So I suppose it's... On the one hand, I want to kind of disclose to my readers and students the operative part of what I do. I mean, I don't think anybody seriously would imagine that history has ever been neutral. But the operative part of it is exactly to try and prevent a monologue or to prevent this sense of apathy or hopelessness. One project, for example, that I asked my graduate students to do was to take a look at the design of the university campus. Now, I should explain that UC Davis is incredibly boring. And, you know, we've got all these mid-century modern buildings, and lots of people, my colleagues and students included, laughed when I said we're going to do an architectural history of the campus. What I was really trying to do, well, I actually do think there is an architectural history there, or at least a design history. And it was great, you know, and for me, by the last session, one of my students said, well, you know, I'm going to leave here now. I've been here, whatever it was, 6 years. She'd done an undergraduate degree, then a master's degree. And she said, you know, I kind of realized, even though this place is really bland, the mission behind it was actually to provide some sort of facility, some sort of machinic apparatus, I guess, for fulfilling the Californian plan for the master plan for higher education. And the architecture was good enough. The landscape architecture was probably more than good enough to provide a sort of convivial setting to educate lots of Californians. And, of course, in that, what I was hoping was that, great, so can we now fall in love again with the University of California and have something to articulate and to start to defend the institution for, you know, for all its failures? You know, there is something there. And I'm not sure that we quite began the seminar feeling the same way.
Yeah, I'm totally fascinated by this idea of public history, and I think we are frightened of it. Like, well, maybe I should speak for myself. I don't imagine any of us writing these sort of watered down histories to a populace, but at the same time, I'm totally fascinated by where history can be taught to different kinds of publics, or as the case may be, certain kinds of privates. That sounded very strange, but you'll understand in just a second. I was just talking to a dean in my school, she and I are talking about me potentially teaching the survey to prisoners in the California prison system, and I was talking to Simon about this the other day, and I think that, you know, is that a public, is that a private? I don't know exactly where we categorize that, but to me, that is like, that's what I want to do. Like, that is cool, you know, and really interesting. And just, it makes me think about what the survey might be. How are you going to teach Bentham? How are you going to teach Bentham to, you know, or, so, you know, as we know, California prison population is a significant part of the population. And I'm completely disappointed with sort of what we might call community architectures or community histories. I find them very patronizing in many ways and very simplistic. And this to me suggests some other opportunity that I'm not sure I've quite seen within our discipline, you know. And I'm very interested, like, where it can go and what might happen with it, because imagine the nervousness you'd feel if you're teaching at one of these places, you know. The prison, what's the prison where Johnny Cash sang? Folsom. Yeah, which is the one on the bay? Is that? What
about San Quentin?
Yeah, Quentin. Sorry, wait. Yeah. San Quentin is the prison that my school has a relationship with. So that's where the classes would be.
What kind
stayed.
of relationship do they have?
Well, if you don't do well and you're, yeah, we've been teaching English courses there. You know, yeah. So yeah.
It's a very nice example. I don't know whether, David, you've ever been disconcerted by the sort of the romantic beauty of San Quentin seen across the water.
It's amazing it hasn't become condos.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing.
The other thing I want to draw out a little bit is either the sense of urgency or immediacy that you're voicing about the topics, or the kind of cultivation, I guess, of a sense of urgency. I think you describe these things as very urgent, immediate, we must know this now kind of task. is that something that seems to you a contemporary aspect of the kind of the work of the architectural historian to work on urgent tasks, or do you also have very slow, low burner kind of work that you're doing as well that you think will not really, you won't really know what it means for the next 8, 10, 12 years? Do you still do that kind of thinking and writing, or is it really urgency? And if so, is the urgency something that this is just the way that now we develop these kind of engagements between architectural history and the world?
Yeah. There's different kinds of urgencies. There's the urgency of, I have to get this subject out because I so passionately believe in it, or I have such problems with the discipline that I have to say these things. And then there's the urgency that everyone in here who teaches and publishes knows, which in an age of blogging, I have to get it out because it's going to appear in another form or online within seconds, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So there's, it's a little, there's a lot of anxiety these days, especially. Yeah.
And I think it's curious because it's more difficult to have the slow burner today than it is the quick reaction. And there's always been the difficulty of trying to publish before someone else gets it to the press. But I mean, for, the work that I've done on Carlo Scarpa, landscapes and gardens, that's a real slow burner for me. In large part because when I first started doing the research, the archives were not available. And now much of the work is being digitized, although I don't look at the digital stuff. I actually go to the archives to look at the drawings, the old-fashioned way. But it's a real slow burner activity for me because when I actually started doing the research, there's still quite a few people alive that worked with them, and I would go and interview them, talk with them about their work on various projects that had a landscape and garden dimension. And that's I use those terms, but literally and metaphorically. Because Gio Ponti talked about the landscape dimension of architectural practice. And I would talk to them about the landscape or the garden that was involved in the project, and they would just look at me like I was insane. And they said, "Well, there was no garden in that project." Yeah, there actually was. And no. Scarpa never did gardens. I said, yeah, he actually did. On the project that you worked on for several years. And they would just look at me as if and then there'd be this slow sort of, and we'd have a conversation, and they'd say, "Oh, you mean blah, 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 blah." I said, "Yeah, I mean the blah, 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 blah," which was to them was the marginalia. It was the detritus. It was the leftover thing. I mean, Scarpa practiced as a landscape and garden designer sort of around the edges because it was politically unpopular in Italy after the Second World War. So he did it in a kind of a covert way. And so to find these things, to find evidence of these things in the archives is something that's really quite difficult because you find it really in the margins of drawings. You can't find it in online sources because they don't know what to photograph. Or they photograph the wrong things, or they don't photograph the back of the drawing as opposed to you only photograph one side of it. So it's the difficulty of having slow burner topics is keeping the flame ignited. And that's part of the challenge.
Keeping up with the literature.
Indeed, yeah.
And not having to rewrite it every time
Right,
you
indeed.
come back to it. Yeah. But it's also, I mean, I guess another topic I didn't talk about that I think is really important is just the intellectual history of our discipline. And in a way, that's what we're writing, sometimes consciously and explicitly, but also sometimes just implicitly with our projects. But it's trying to trace and track how our definitions of history, landscape, building are actually changing, and understand, who they're changing for and why they're changing. Are they changing because architects are unable to get work and all of a sudden are working in urban farms, as in the case of my research, or is it because the profession is being driven in a certain direction? I mean, I think that's something that we could keep as an ongoing project and need to as the historians of our discipline.
There's certainly a kind of a very sweeping scale to some of the things you're trying to investigate: infrastructure, the whole issue of reform, the kind of scale of infrastructure, and the kind of recovery of ephemeral environments, and so on. But am I right in also characterizing the work, the way that you're moving into that is fairly strategically small scale? That there's a kind of move. None of you are writing expansive, long duration very synthetic histories of these facts. That you're writing minor histories, proposing in this set of experiments very discrete object examples, and using those to, well, are you using those to stand for these larger things, or are you using those because those are this is the way in to material that we have now, or is the larger synthetic kind of historical work still possible? Is that something that we'll deal with? Can we write about globalization? All the other disciplines seem to be able to write about globalization. And we use the word a lot in books and journals, but we don't actually really write about globalization in the sense of produce histories and theories of globalization. Is that a sort of congenital weakness, or are you finding the way into that with this more kind of tactical sort of history that you do?
I think this idea of minor history, I'm totally fascinated with that too. In fact, that book that you mentioned, Subnature, was originally supposed to be called Minor Nature before the title was changed. And so I'm totally fascinated with this accumulation of little things and how big the scale of the work basically is up to the historian or the writer to see how much stuff they can accumulate the volume. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you'd agree with this, but in some ways I think a book that is being used a lot now for the survey, which I think is a big book, like the Global History of Architecture that Wiley published with Mark Yarzenbeck. Maybe some of you have in your course. Yeah, and sorry, all the other people. Yeah. But I think of that as an accumulation of yes. and that accumulated quite a bit of material. So I think that I don't disagree with things that maybe people said like 5 years ago, like history is going to die a death of 1,000 cuts because some of us are writing things about dust or whatever, or little buildings here and there. I think the way you gather it all up and make a quote unquote big project is key, mm-hmm. and sort of where the technique is. Yeah.
I think there are also opportunities for working collectively to try to assemble, I mean, in the spirit of Lenin, what is to be written. I really was thinking that there are so many of us who have PhDs and who are writing history because of the proliferation of PhD programs in architecture in the 70s and 80s. And so I think we can start to connect some of our research together and make maybe bigger sweeping histories in groups or in collaboration rather than in the very specific ways that we do through our own work. But I mean, I think all of us maybe aspire to that to some degree, but we're trained to get at our arguments through objects and through buildings, and I think there might be a natural resistance to the sweeping history in that as well.
Timothy, we should probably open it up to some questions before.
In particular, I think the audience here is also the audience that demands or is going to demand a certain kind of knowledge and production of knowledge from the four of you, from myself, and from the kind of history theory cohort more generally. So maybe the kind of last question I would pose to you while they prepare their questions is, already what kinds of demands do you see or do you face from your students, from your colleagues, that are substantially different from what you say experienced or anticipated when you were training as historians? Is there a request for a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of understanding, a different kind of material from the profession, whether it's the profession out in the world or the profession as it's embedded within the academy, or are we still being asked for the kinds of historical knowledge that we were asked for in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s?
Well, I started teaching during the second Reagan administration. So, the kind of student that one had then has transformed dramatically, I think, from the kind of student we have today in architecture, in architectural education. I found in the 1980s into the 1990s that there was a more open-endedness to the dialogue with students about history and theory and architectural production. There seemed to be more interest in, I guess to use a tired phrase, knowledge for its own sake. And now I find that by and large students are looking for something that is operational. Mm-hmm. If they can't eat it or fornicate with it, they don't want to talk about it. So there's which puts certain limitations on the faculty. And on one hand, I understand entirely their point of view, but I actually tell my students, quite in contrast to what you were saying earlier, I actually tell my students that especially in seminars, history and theory seminars I have with them, that if I'm successful, nothing that we talk about in here will be useful. That you're not going to be able to take any of this out and just use it. You can't take this into the studio and plug it in. Because architectural discourse, historically, the treatises are all done as reflections on stuff made. So unlike theory in the sciences, in the arts and in architecture, architectural theory is reflective. And so we reflect and then we make. And so in that way, once they sort of understand that kind of operation, they sort of, I think they understand the utility and the more general functionality of architectural discourse. But it takes, for me, I think it takes a kind of re-education of both the student and the faculty.
We entertain questions from the audience. And you're welcome to question each other, too. I don't want to forbid that. You just have to wait for your mic.
Hi, thank you very much. Every one of you is a teacher, and every one of you works in a university context. And I was wondering, specifically in regard to all that you've talked about for agency and doing scholarly work that is not necessarily always worked through writing, I was wondering, would it be possible for you to develop a scholar-architect practice that is entirely outside of the academy? Would you consider doing that?
Well, can you imagine doing it first, and then,
I mean,
would you?
I worked as a curator for many years, so that would be like a great example of something. It's not really an academic position, but that's a kind of position where I mean, in a way, you're doing many of the things that I showed in the images, right? You're working and historicizing objects. You start writing about them. You're not necessarily having very much contact with the academy, but that's just one way that can happen. I would love to see more practices, right? It's many of the things that I have shown, I think, often appear in art practices or art contexts, because that's where people can get paid. It's sort of set up for that kind of work. So, I mean, I love your question. I love the possibility of that, but I do consider things like how do you pay the bills and how are you going to eat? So, yes, I would love to see new kinds of peripheral, marginal practices emerge between traditional writing and architectural practices. And I think, in fact, what I take from your question is it's sort of the responsibility of us who are invoking these practices to sort of push and figure out how they can appear outside the academy. So, yeah.
I think we're also moving towards an economic system where it's less and less possible to get paid to do this kind of work or to even do architectural work. And so I think we're going to be forced to figure out how to do things that we really care about doing outside of a lot of the traditionally supportive structures that we've had for them in the past, and we're going to have to invent new supportive structures. So whether that means free editing labor from our friends or electronic publishing or that sort of thing, I think at least in the case of my work, even though I have a job as a teacher, a lot of the research that I've done hasn't been supported directly by the academy. It's been stuff that I've done in my own time or with grants from art institutions or state and local grants for the arts and things like that. So I think we're going to have to be a lot more creative about how we commission and structure our work, but that also means that we're going to have different audiences to answer to, and that's both good and bad. I think it's kind of dangerous in some ways.
Thank you for your question. My immediate response, I couldn't think of any answer at all, because I kind of so depend on universities for my livelihood and pay my mortgage and so on. And then I remember that, in fact, we're having a symposium at the University of California coming up about Californian architecture. But one of the things that we're hoping to do with it, because I don't really know the answer, but we're hoping to sort of think about an answer to that. And toward that end, we're inviting people to come along to the symposium, and not really actually to present papers, but instead to have a sort of talking shop. And we've put out that call not simply to academics or other historians, but anybody who thinks that the architecture of California is something that they're concerned about in some way in their own area. So it seems that we will have people, let's say, from real estate and museums and journalists. And I'm really excited to see if it is possible to think about that more rounded and connected way of looking at the subject.
Thank you. I'm so glad that you asked the question about if you're able to think and write about larger themes. And if the question that was raised, which is what is to be written, in a way is like a challenge as to what are the urgent issues of our society that we should be writing about, I was very interested in your individual tracks as to where you're writing, but then the question comes, aren't there deeper, profounder issues at this critical time in our life that ought to also be addressed and particularly brought to the consciousness of the student? I mean, we're at the level of highly environmental crisis, simultaneous of financial crisis and social disruption crisis. And I just wonder, are you all writing about these things? Are you researching about these things? Are you preparing the mind of the student of how to handle the fact that we're moving from, I mean, I don't know, when I was a student here 100 years ago, I guess we might have been, I don't know, 2 to 3 billion people in the world, and suddenly we're 7 billion people in the world, moving to 9 billion people in the world. Are there these other deeper questions that you're going to be writing about? Thank you.
I think the, at several points you're referring to a kind of ethical dimension in the work. I think you, Simon, very explicitly, but all of you are referring to a kind of ethical dimension. And is that carried out? In what way is that carried out by teaching students about certain things? And in what way is it carried out by teaching them how to think in certain ways? I think it's a very interesting aspect of the question is that you distinguish between those two things. So you can teach about a crisis and you can teach how to think in a way that perhaps relates to crisis. So in those two dimensions, how do you pose your work?
I mean, I enjoy your question very much, and I can think of many ways to answer it. I think one of the things that I try to do when teaching a historical survey, for example, is teach the students not to project their time back into the times of others. And I think many of the things you mentioned, population explosion, ecological crisis, for me, deal with the destruction of worlds and life worlds. And so I think when I have students realize, when you don't project backwards and you understand there's a view, perhaps of medieval life or in Mesoamerica that is now lost from us, that we just really does not exist anymore, I think they understand that history is a story of tragedies and continuities, right? And so without being so direct and sort of turning them into activists, I think you can give an appreciation of that. And just to continue very briefly, this new project that I'm working on is a sort of mashup of architecture, environmental, and history of New York City in the 1970s. And I promised myself I wouldn't show any images of graffiti or subways falling apart. And how would you do a history of the city in which there's something else going on that people have overlooked, right? That talks about how a city dealt with crisis that may not necessarily be a model for the future, but that you understand that, that A, what we're going through is not necessarily unique, although some aspects of it certainly aren't unique, but also that the way that we understand crisis itself needs to be modified. The crisis even then wasn't exactly what we think it was. So just these, these particular ways. Yeah.
I think also when we teach about particular moments in the history of architecture, we really want to look at what architects did to engage with all of the problems that you're mentioning, obviously within their own time. But I think one thing that really interests me is trying to figure out what the agency of an architect is to do something about the problems that you're discussing, and how people actually tried to tackle those problems at different times. So I think if we were just to sort of say, like, we're stuck in an ecological crisis, what do? we would come up with a million answers and be overwhelmed. But if we were to say, what do architects do when they're contending with the ecological crisis? Well, in the 60s, some architects, went away to California and built dome cities and had independent vegetable gardens. Other architects tried to design complex systems for distributing food that would make the city sustainable and strengthen connections between city and rural areas. So it's questions like that I think are really important to get at, so that students have a very specific understanding of architectural agency and architectural techniques and how they evolved over time. So if we're going to look at questions like that, it has to be as part of a larger story that we're telling about our profession and how it's transformed.
Can I ask we'll take one more question, but can I ask just more bluntly, do you feel like you're teaching your students an ethical stance?
No.
No?
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I don't think that's something that I could teach. I mean, that would be really presumptuous. I think I can present options of projects that architects have done, and this is what I try to do as a teacher and a writer that I think are either admirable or terrible, and talk about why. That's what we do as critics too. I think we're all here as scholar critics, but I don't think that we could teach that to someone directly.
Yeah, from my perspective, I mean, the aspirational thing is criticality as opposed to ethics. I think if one can engage students critically and they can start becoming critical about what they're reading and what they're doing, then I think you really achieved something. And in terms of the question about, when I first got the email about this gig, these are precisely the questions that came to mind, and at which point I needed a drink, and so I took all those questions and I put them over here. In large part, though, I know that the way I address teaching history and theory to students of architecture, outside of the seminar, in the larger classroom, is in every lecture I have to bring it back to their world somehow, and this world is things are not well placed today. It's not a tidy world that we live in. But if you don't bring it back to the world in which they live in, to the present tense, then it's just stuff that happened to dead people, and that's not particularly interesting. So I think making it that present tense is fundamental to, and that deals with the crises as well. Ultimately, I find that the teaching of architecture is teaching about watershed moments that occur that essentially is a story of crises.
Yeah, I'm not trained as a moral philosopher, political philosopher. It would be awful if I tried to teach ethics. But I hesitate.
You are moral.
I'm a very moral man, and but the reason I hesitate though to answer the question is because I think there is part of me that I do in front of a class start to feel evangelical, and I think the reason for that is what I'm trying to show is that. As far as I can see, architecture and design is always about ethics, and it's always about teleology and politics, and you can see the architects becoming political subjects. So rather than say, well, we've now found out what we should be doing, I do think that it's my job to show that every time we do something, we're looking for that ethics, we're looking for that politics or teleology. So I'm trying to make them aware of the fact that it's a bit like, you can't not know history, you can't not know ethics and politics. That's not an option available to you. So I want my students to be aware of that.
I think we have to draw things to a close. We can take one more question.
Well, you were discussing the idea of history as being past, dealing with the past issues, but it also has, say, Renaissance. It goes into the various phases of the Renaissance, and then after 150 years or 200 years, it has a conclusion to that time period. And during that time period, it's in a sense looking back at the past as a predictive model for how it begins and how it ends. So what I'm wondering is, if you're looking at modernism, from a historical standpoint, it has certain phases. And we don't necessarily know it, but we are in the present now, right? So you're looking at it from the point of view of the present. I'm interested in how you can use your past predictive models to anticipate the future potential for a design.
Do you see yourselves as modeling futures rather than contextualizing the present? Certainly some of our predecessors
I'd make a lot
did.
of money if I did that.
Yeah.
I know it's a terrible thing to do is to hijack somebody's question, but what actually your interesting question brought to my mind was what I'm worried about in history at the moment is there seems to be a witch hunt for the causes of neoliberalism, and we seem to have gone back to history and said, you did some corporate stuff then, and the counterculture was interested in self-organization and systems, and so I'm actually guarded against that idea that there is, I'm trying to sort of get beyond good and evil and looking for this leading to that. I see it as much more complex, and I suppose because of that, I'm resistant to the idea that this now will lead to that. Just history hasn't worked like that.
I remember right after 9/11 that newspapers everywhere were asking historians for their opinion about what the future city would be, right? Do you remember that? And I mean, if you read those things now, my God, the end of skyscrapers, the end of airplanes, the end of airports, the end. And reading all that and honestly participating briefly in that. Lesson learned that you stay away from the future. That there's a lot of opportunity for embarrassment, and hyperbole, So I think. Yeah.
Barbara Walters on CNN phoned me once and asked, was it possible to terrorist-proof government buildings?
Oh yeah.
And do you know what?
She phoned you to ask that?
Yeah.
Wow.
And I actually found myself vain enough to try and answer this, and then concluded actually no, and kind of very disappointed.
You brought up the Onion obituary of Steve Jobs, which eulogized him as the last man in America who knew what he was doing. Previously to that, though, the Onion published a report on a gathering of America's historians who pleaded with the nation to remember that lots of things had happened in a place called the past. And some of them had actually turned out really, really badly. So there is a place, I think, for the historians, not necessarily as prediction of the future, but certainly contextualization, as verified by the Onion. So, but thank you all so much for the comments and participation tonight.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks for arranging this.
Yeah, it was fun.